Chief Opothleyahola stood as a Muskogee Creek Indian leader renowned for his diplomatic prowess and exceptional gift for oratory. He served as a speaker for the Upper Creek Council and championed the preservation of traditional Creek culture. Opothleyahola came into the world around 1780 at Tuckabashie, the Creek capital of the Upper Creek towns, in what is now Elmore County, Alabama. His father, Davy Cornell, was of mixed Creek heritage, while his mother was a full-blooded Creek from Tuckabashie. His name translates to child, good, whooper, or good speaker. An alternative interpretation renders it as good shouting child. Though Yahola descended from both European and Creek lineage, his birth to a Creek mother meant the tribe considered him part of her clan from birth, and he was raised according to Creek customs. The Creek followed a matrilineal kinship structure for property ownership and lineage, meaning the mother's family and clan established the standing of her children. Traditionally, her brothers played a more vital role in raising the children than the biological father did. The Upper Creeks constituted the larger segment of the nation. Facing pressure from European Americans, Lower Creek leaders negotiated treaties with the state of Georgia to surrender former hunting territories in 1790, 1802, and 1804. The Lower Creek had maintained longer and deeper connections with European Americans, who had arrived as merchants and colonists since the colonial era. The Creek had already forfeited access to the land for hunting due to settler expansion. They started embracing more agricultural methods to sustain themselves. Under demands from Georgia and its settlers, they also developed closer ties with Benjamin Hawkins, the U.S. Indian agent for the Southeast. The friction between the Upper Creek and Lower Creek factions erupted into bloodshed in 1812, in what initially appeared as a civil conflict. The Red Sticks of the Upper Creek sought to restore traditional culture and spirituality and opposed assimilation and the surrender of territory. Opothleyahola is thought to have sided with the British against the U.S. military as early as the War of 1812. Despite his reputation as a diplomatic chief and advocate for tradition, he joined the Red Sticks during the Creek War of 1813 to 1814. This conflict concluded with defeat at the hands of General Andrew Jackson, who led a substantial Allied army, including Lower Creek warriors, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Following the defeat, Opothleyahola pledged his loyalty to the federal government. He gained prominence around 1820 as the spokesman for the Council of the Upper Creek people, predominantly full-bloods who maintained their traditional culture. He subsequently rose to become a diplomatic chief. The Lower Creeks, by contrast, embraced the customs of the region's white settlers. Deepening this divide, a considerable number of the Lower Creeks viewed favorably the prospect of trading their eastern homeland for territory west of the Mississippi River. In 1825, William McIntosh, along with several Lower Creek chiefs, put their names to the Second Treaty of Indian Springs with the U.S., surrendering most of the Creek's remaining Georgia territories in exchange for compensation and relocation to lands west of the Mississippi River. By that point, McIntosh and others in the treaty party had concluded that removal was unavoidable. Considering the swelling numbers of European American settlers pouring into their territory, and they sought to secure the most advantageous arrangement possible for the Creek Nation. Disturbed by the territorial surrenders made by chiefs of the lower towns without collective tribal approval, the National Council of the Creek Confederacy established a law designating further land cessions by tribal members as punishable by death. Nevertheless, the National Council didn't abandon efforts to oppose United States encroachment. It issued a death verdict endorsed by Opothleyahola against McIntosh and other signers of the 1825 treaty. Chief Menawak commanded 200 warriors to strike at McIntosh's plantation. They executed him and another signatory chief and set fire to McIntosh's mansion on April 30th, 1825. The Creek elders recognized they would require skilled negotiators to argue their position before federal authorities. While Opothleyahola possessed persuasive speaking abilities, he lacked fluency in English. They sought assistance from the Cherokee. Major Ridge, a Cherokee leader, suggested that the Creek employ his son, John Ridge, and David Van, to accompany Opothleyahola and assist in formulating his negotiating strategies. The Creek National Council, headed by Opothleyahola, journeyed to Washington, D.C. to challenge the legitimacy of the 1825 treaty, asserting its signatories lacked the consensus of the council. President John Quincy Adams showed sympathy, and the U.S. government and the chiefs negotiated a new treaty with improved conditions, the Treaty of Washington in 1826. When the Alabama legislature also moved to dissolve tribal governments and impose state laws over the Creek people, Opothleyahola appealed to the administration of President Andrew Jackson. But Jackson had already enacted the 1830 Indian Removal Act and desired the Creek and other tribes to relocate westward and relinquish their eastern land claims. Receiving no assistance, the Upper Creek signed the Treaty of Cusseta on March 24, 1832, which partitioned Creek lands into individual portions. They could either sell their portions and obtain money to relocate to Indian Territory, or remain in Alabama as state and U.S. citizens and abide by state laws. This quickly resulted in the departure of the remaining tribe members to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. In 1834, Opothleyahola journeyed to Nacogdoches, Texas, attempting to acquire communal land for his people. After he had paid property owners $20,000, pressure from both the Mexican and American governments compelled Opothleyahola to relinquish the plan. In 1836, Yahola, appointed as a colonel by the U.S. government, commanded 1,500 warriors against the remaining rebellious Lower Creek, who had joined forces with Seminole in Florida in resisting European-American occupation. The U.S. Army gathered up the remaining Creek and other Southeast Indian peoples and compelled their migration to Indian Territory on what became known as the Trail of Tears. Subsequently, Opothleyahola guided 8,000 people from Alabama to lands north of the Canadian River in the Indian Territory, to the unassigned lands. With time, they started to focus on livestock raising and grain cultivation, as neither the soil nor the weather proved suitable for subsistence farming. Yahola became a prosperous trader and owned a 2,000-acre cotton plantation near North Fork Town, roughly 3 miles east of present Eufaula in McIntosh County. Like other Creek and members of the 5 civilized tribes, he acquired and held enslaved African Americans as laborers for his plantation. In other adjustments to European-American culture, Opothleyahola joined the Freemasons and embraced Christianity, becoming a Baptist. Due to the intersection of the Texas and California roads there, the community thrived as a commercial hub. During the California Gold Rush of 1849, North Fork Town functioned as a meeting point for travelers heading west along the California Road. 49ers bought provisions, horses, and mules from local traders. When the Civil War erupted, Albert Pike, an Arkansas lawyer and politician and later a general, was appointed Confederate Commissioner to Indian Territory. He started recruiting several American Indian regiments for the Confederacy and arranged alliance treaties with the Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw at North Fork Town in July 1861. The Lower Creek and some of the other southeastern tribes who had concentrated on cotton cultivation possessed numerous slaves and maintained more cultural interaction with white settlers. They backed the Confederacy, which assured them an Indian-controlled state if they prevailed in the war. The settlement functioned as a Confederate supply depot during the Civil War. Nevertheless, Opothleyahola and his group of Creek Indians stayed loyal to the federal government. They held that the southern populations in Georgia and Alabama had driven their removal. Those Creek with African ancestry opposed the limitations of proposed black codes and grew more aligned with the Union. Refugees of enslaved African Americans, free people of color, Chickasaw, and Seminole Indians started congregating at Opothlayahola's plantation. They aspired to stay neutral in the struggle between the North and South. On August 15, 1861, Opothleyahola and Tribal Chief Miko Hutko reached out to President Abraham Lincoln to request assistance for the Loyalists. On September 10th, they received an encouraging reply, stating that the United States government would aid them. The correspondence instructed Opothleyahola to relocate his people to Fort Row in Wilson County, Kansas, where they would obtain asylum and support. Trusting federal assurances of assistance, Opothleyahola guided his group, including Seminole under Halleck Tustanugee, toward Kansas. On November 15th, Confederate Colonel Douglas H. Cooper, a former U.S. Indian agent, marched 1,400 men, including pro-Confederate Indians, northward, determined to either persuade Opothleyahola and his followers to embrace the Confederacy or to force him and his party from the territory. This precipitated the Battle of Round Mountain on November 19th, where the Creek pushed back the Confederates toward Fort Gibson. On December 9th, the Creek experienced a setback at the Battle of Chustautalasa. On December 26th, Opothleyahola and his band endured a devastating defeat. Most of the Creek possessed only the garments they wore and lacked adequate footwear and shelter, as they had departed hastily. Opothleyahola lost an estimated 2,000 of his 9,000 followers from the conflicts, illness, and severe winter storms during their doomed journey to Fort Row. When they reached the fort, the soldiers couldn't obtain additional supplies and lacked sufficient medical assistance for the refugees. The Creek were compelled to relocate to Fort Belmont, but circumstances remained abysmal. Many Creek perished that winter, including Opothlayahola's daughter. The Creek in Kansas continued to face very challenging circumstances. On March 22, 1863, Opothleyahola passed away at the Creek refugee camp next to the Sac and Fox Agency at Quanemo in Osage County, Kansas. He was laid to rest beside his daughter near Fort Belmont in Woodson County, Kansas.